Good morning to members of the media, and let me take this opportunity to thank you for coming out to what we consider to be a very important press conference. And this morning I'm speaking as the General Secretary of the Joint Trade Union Movement and Chief Education and Research Officer and Executive Trustee of the OWTU, as well as the other progressive social movements in Trinidad and Tobago. And with me is the political leader of the Movement for Social Justice, and in effect this is a sort of a joint press conference to express two things: a concern about our neighbor, as well as to express our solidarity with the people of Venezuela as well as the Bolivarian revolution. We call this press conference because we have some concerns about what we see as a rising aggression by the powers of the North, in particular the United States, under the presidency of Donald Trump. Increase of aggression against the people of Venezuela. For us, the region of Latin America and the Caribbean is a region that has to be a space free of imperialist aggression. It has to be a space of peace and stability. The attempt to intervene, and destabilize a neighboring country, we see that as a grave threat to the peace and security of this region. We therefore are of the firm view that any attempt to interfere and to destabilize Venezuela will ultimately destabilize the entire region, and for Trinidad and Tobago in particular, which is so close to Venezuela, it can also destabilize our own country. And therefore, we are calling for there to be peace and stability and for the non-interference into the political process in Venezuela, and to allow the people of Venezuela to determine their own destiny. We hold true to those principles. And we say this because there has been, throughout our recent history in this region, continued U.S. intervention. And I will just list a few for you. Dominican Republic in 1965, Guatemala 1966, Chile in 1973, El Salvador 1981 to 92, Nicaragua 1981 to 1990, Honduras 1982 to 1990, Grenada 1983, Bolivia in 1987, Panama in 1989, Haiti in 1994, Venezuela in 2002, Haiti again in 2004, and Honduras in 2009. Let me just take this opportunity to welcome Kafra Kambon of the Emancipation Support Committee, who will be joining us here this morning and to make this very important statement. So I thought I'd share this with members of the public through you, the media, this recent history of interventionism by the United States in the region, not just in Latin America, but right here in the Caribbean. And therefore, we denounce any intervention by the United States in the internal affairs of countries. The presidential elections in Venezuela has been announced. It will be the 20th of May. And in all of the elections thus far, all of the necessary authorities have always confirmed that those elections have been free and fair. In fact, I myself was an international observer in the 2015 parliamentary elections, where the opposition actually won that election. And in that instance, the President Maduro, as well as the PSUV, confirmed and recognized that victory and that electoral process. And therefore, we believe that any suggestion or any attempt to delegitimize what is clearly a free and fair electoral process is part of a campaign to destabilize a sovereign nation. The other thing is that we have seen attempts to derail the process of dialogue. And we are of the view that dialogue is the answer, not the use of military force as being threatened by the United States. We believe that dialogue and allowing the political process to run its course is the only way to bring about peace and stability in Venezuela. But I also have to say, before I go to read what is known as the Caracas Declaration, that we in the social movements, in the progressive movements, in the Trinidad and Tobago, but also in the Caribbean, we believe that there is an alternative to neoliberal free market capitalism. Is an alternative, and we must continue to explore these alternatives. We also believe that there has to be an alternative to the Monroe Doctrine and regional hegemony. We cannot, as social movements, accept regional hegemony in this part of the world. Regional hegemony only leads to instability, pain, and suffering of ordinary persons, and we only have to look to other parts of the world where we've seen U.S. interventionism and Western interventionism has led to the destruction, absolute destruction of countries, and bringing about pain and suffering for millions of people. We also want to say that we believe in an alternative to what we call bourgeois dictatorship, meaning the control of elites, small elites who control resources and wealth. We believe that a combination of these things lead to greater inequality in a country. It leads to greater suffering for the poor. It does not eliminate grave inequalities and so on. So I thought I'll set the tone for this morning's press conference with those introductory remarks. Now, recently, in Venezuela, on it would have been the 5th to the 7th of March, some 245 international delegates from 5 continents across the world participated in what became known as the Caracas Declaration. And we've had several endorsements on this declaration, including organizations like the Caribbean Peace Movement, the Caribbean chapter of the International Network in Defense of Humanity, Caribbean Movement for Peace and Integration, Caribbean Pan-African Network, and a whole range of other organizations from Barbados, Guyana, St. Lucia, Martinique, and of course right here in Trinidad and Tobago. One of those organizations that have endorsed the declaration is the Emancipation Support Committee. And I would like to now turn over just to say a few words. A long-standing fighter against injustice and inequality. I think he's no stranger to history, and I think it is very important to have that voice also be raised in solidarity with the Venezuelan people and, of course, against the type of interventionism that we are seeing. So I would like to hand over to Comrade Kafra Kambon to say a few words.
Morning to the members of the media and my colleagues here, Ozzy and David. Once I was asked to be a part of this conference, I thought it was extremely important because the face of our region can change overnight in a way that would be very dastardly for all of us who live in this region. Even the lead up to what is definitely an attempt to stage a coup and perhaps a military intervention, if that cannot work in Venezuela, all these steps are there and very clear before us. And Venezuela, you know, is 7 miles away from Trinidad and Tobago. And over the last few decades, Venezuela has played an extremely important role in the Caribbean region. It is sad that a number of Caribbean countries have not had the strength to stand up morally with Venezuela at this time. And some have gone as far as to actually betray a country that from the time of Chavez has helped to float a lot of economies in the Caribbean. And the U.S. is not going to play the role that Venezuela has played. We need to praise the governments of St. Vincent and the Grenadines, Dominica, and Suriname for standing up with Venezuela in this time of crisis. The others who benefited from the Petro-Carib and all other forms of assistance from Venezuela are too afraid to stand up with Venezuela now, and some have actually betrayed Venezuela. Those who joined the Lima group, which was a group formed because CARICOM, to its credit at an earlier stage, took a stand in the OAS that prevented an intervention, a military intervention in Venezuela. But since then, the pressures that have been put on CARICOM governments are telling, and you find that only those 3 countries that I spoke about dared to vote against anti-Venezuela resolutions in the more recent times. And I want to appeal to the public of Trinidad and Tobago to recognize what it would mean if you have the destabilization in Venezuela that has taken place in all those areas that the United States has gone to bring democracy and is in the process of bringing democracy. Like Syria, where they are bringing democracy to Syria now. They brought democracy to Libya. You know, they brought democracy to Iraq, you know, Afghanistan. And everywhere they have brought democracy so far, we are seeing displacement. Well, that also starts with D, degradation, and everything else. And we will not want to have that on our borders. It is also going to affect a flood of refugees coming to Trinidad and Tobago. And it is really going to change things substantially for us as well. But simply on the basis of principle, where we have the capacity at least to delegitimize any planned intervention by the United States or its proxies and allies to destroy a country in our region, we owe it to humanity and we owe it to ourselves to take a stand against any such manner of intervention. And that is what I would say in my opening. Yes, sir.
Thank you. Cambon, the Emancipation Support Committee. I will now hand over to Comrade David Abdullah, political leader of the Movement for Social Justice, who have, since the beginning, have always stand in solidarity with the Bolivarian Revolution.
Thank you very much, Ozzy, and morning, Kafra, morning to members of the media, and also to Asher Cambon, who is sitting quietly here as well, member of the Emancipation Support Committee. We, as Ozzy has just said, as the MSJ, we have always taken a position of principle with respect to recognizing international principles of relations between states. One of those is respect for sovereignty. One of those is respect for the right of a people to self-determination. In other words, that the people within a country have the right to decide how they wish to proceed, and nobody from outside can tell them or force them to proceed in a different direction. And thirdly, that we must recognize that the relationship between states must be governed by principles governed by the United Nations and so on. So in that regard, it's very important for small countries like Trinidad and Tobago and the other countries in the Caribbean to respect these international principles and to adhere to them, because if we don't stand up and speak out against the United States and others who wish to violate those principles by interfering in the internal affairs of Venezuela or infringing on the sovereignty of Venezuela by military aggression and so on, then what would happen to us as much smaller countries we then will have no voice speaking out for us if intervention by external forces takes place in Trinidad and Tobago. So we must at all times stand up on principle, and that is what the MSJ has done consistently. And we want to, therefore, also say, as a political party, we have the right to have relations with other political parties. Now, this is not government-to-government relationships. This is party-to-party relationships. And we are a member of the Sao Paulo Forum, which brings together progressive political parties from throughout Latin America and the Caribbean. We are one of the very few English parties in the English-speaking Caribbean, Anglophone Caribbean, that is a member of the Sao Paulo Forum. And the parties in Venezuela, the party of President Maduro, the one that was founded by President Chavez, the PSUV, is also a member of the Sao Paulo Forum, and therefore we also stand in solidarity with our fellow Foro party, the PSUV, and we have bilateral relations with them as parties. So I just want to read a statement that we issued a week ago, a little bit more than a week ago, on the occasion of the 5th anniversary of the passing of President Chavez. On Monday, March 5th, 2018, the Movement for Social Justice, together with countless others who are involved in the struggle for social justice, commemorated the 5th anniversary of the passing of President Hugo Chavez Frias. President Chavez was undoubtedly one of the most important historic figures of the 21st century. In just over a decade, as President of Venezuela, he began a process of transformation, not only of his own country, but of Latin America. Some of the outstanding achievements of President Chavez included redressing the legacy of poverty and inequality in Venezuela through policies of redistributing that country's oil wealth towards the provision of educational opportunities for all, improving healthcare, increasing access to decent housing, addressing gender and ethnic injustice. And let me just stick a pin there and say that there is no doubt that all of the data confirms that poverty was cut by more than half, that people who had no access to education before had that access, including major literacy programs, because the illiteracy rate in Venezuela was very high, that healthcare was delivered to communities that never had healthcare before, huge housing projects, and so on, and the issue of indigenous people in Venezuela and Afro-Venezuelans who had been marginalized by the elite, which is traditionally the white Venezuelans and so on. Those issues, for the first time, were being redressed, not completely solved, but being redressed in a significant way. President Chavez also offered a vision and created mechanisms for the integration of Latin America and the Caribbean on the basis not of imperial power, which has been traditional, the US relations and so on, and exploitation, but of solidarity, as, for example, ALBA, Petrocaribe, and Kafra made mention of that, Telesur, the strengthening of Mercosur, which is the Southern Cone regional integration process, and the establishment of CELAC, which is a community of Latin American and Caribbean states. And he also provided hope that another world is possible, which saw progressive parties and movements winning elections and forming governments throughout Latin America, Brazil with Lula, Argentina, Bolivia, Paraguay, Uruguay, Ecuador, Nicaragua, El Salvador, and Honduras. And the reason why we make reference to that is that since all of those governments had progressive people being elected, there has been a very clear strategy by the right wing in those countries, supported by the United States and other forces outside, to reverse all of those political and social gains. And so in Paraguay, where a former Roman Catholic Archbishop Hugo was democratically elected as president, there was a constitutional coup d'etat where the parliament impeached him in 2 days. In Brazil, we saw what happened with President Dilma Rousseff. In Honduras, the Supreme Court removed the democratically elected president, Zelaya, and so on. These achievements, however, cannot and will never be erased from history, and the MSJ salutes President Chavez for his vision and dedicating his life to the cause of social justice and the Bolivarian revolution. At the same time, however, we condemn those right-wing forces who seek to destroy the Bolivarian revolution and all that President Chavez fought and died to create. These forces of reaction are comprised of the old economic elites in Venezuela, the oligarchs who traditionally held power and benefited from wealth and privilege that came with that power. These elites never accepted the will of the majority of Venezuelans who time after time democratically, we want to reiterate that, democratically elected President Chavez and his party to positions of office at the state level, municipal level, and in the parliament. So intent were these right-wing reactionary forces that they carried out a coup d'etat against President Chavez, which coup was defeated by the mass of Venezuelans who came out in defense of their elected president. Again, that is very important for us to trace that there was an actual coup d'etat against a democratically elected President Chavez, because the right wing never accepted what he was trying to do to change and transform Venezuelan society. And when that coup d'etat took place, the US State Department issued a statement in Washington. They came out on television, and media in Trinidad have to do these things, have to do that research. They came out and made a statement acknowledging the new government of Venezuela. So the United States, which preaches democracy, recognized a military overthrow of the democratically elected President Chavez. Since the passing of President Chavez, these right-wing forces have intensified their actions to bring about regime change by any means against the democratically elected President Nicolas Maduro. These forces are not interested in democracy. They simply want to take back the power that they lost in order to continue their life of wealth and privilege. When they fail to properly initiate a recall referendum because they violated the constitutional requirements, they screamed that they wanted elections. And then, contrary to their so-called belief in democracy and peace, they carried out violent protests. And again, contrary to the reports out of BBC and CNN, which only focused on one aspect and so on, those protests were violent protests. People were killed in the streets, not by the police or by the military. They were killed by the protesters. People were burnt alive and so on. These protests were never stopped. They continued for 3-4 months, all right, on the streets until they ran out of steam and so on. And when the violent protests failed because the majority of Venezuelans wanted peace, they once again demonstrated that they were not interested in the democratic process by boycotting the elections for the National Constituent Assembly, which assembly is recognized in the Venezuelan Constitution as the original will of the people. So people shouted out that President Maduro is a dictator because he is calling this National Constituent Assembly, where the National Constituent Assembly is provided for in the Constitution of Venezuela as the original will of the people. And there was an election for the Constituent Assembly, and people were duly democratically elected to form that body. And so, in the face of the overwhelming support by the people for the Constituent National Assembly, the right wing then changed their tune and took part in the elections for state governors. So although they took no part in the elections for the Constituent Assembly because they said that was undemocratic, the Constituent Assembly then set the date for the elections. They realized that the tide was going against them, so they took part in the elections for state governors. They changed the tune. I was there. I witnessed the elections of state governors. I had a media conference, if you remember, at the party office when I showed you the whole process. I put up a PowerPoint with photographs of the entire process of people lining up, provision for people to sit down, people, how they voted, and all of that, and showed how that process of elections is actually probably even tighter, fairer, and less possible of manipulation than our process in Trinidad and Tobago. Media members, you recall that press conference, and so on. And some of those governorships were won by the right-wing parties. And then the government of President Maduro, committed as it is to democracy and peace, then agreed to a process of dialogue initiated by the President of the Dominican Republic. And we need to speak about these things. The President of the Dominican Republic called a process of dialogue, and 4 other governments took part in that. Chile and Mexico, who were supportive of the opposition, and I think it was Bolivia and Nicaragua supported of the government. So here you had 5 governments sitting as mediators between the opposition and the government in Venezuela. And that process focused on the way forward, including setting a date for the presidential elections. An agreement was arrived at after compromises were made by both the government and opposition for an April election for president. And then, having agreed on that, the opposition then reneged on that agreement and said April, because the government wanted March, the opposition wanted May, and a compromise was set for April. And then, in an act of duplicity, the opposition reneged on the agreement for an April election date. And President Maduro said, well, we would then proceed with the April date as agreed with the opposition. And then a number of people were objecting and so on. And he conceded and agreed now to a May date for the presidential and municipal elections, which is the date which the opposition originally had demanded, and so on. But again, these right-wing forces have demonstrated that they are neither interested in democracy nor peace, as they have condemned the holding of elections. So they say they're about democracy and elections, but they're condemning an electoral process and don't want to take part. The MSJ is very clear in our position. The right wing is not about democracy. They want regime change so as to totally destroy the Bolivarian revolution and the legacy of President Chavez. That is what they are intent on. And in this, these right-wing oligarchs and elites are being supported by a revitalized U.S. imperialism under Donald Trump. Indeed, we have no doubt that it is a support from the Trump administration that has resulted in sections of the opposition repudiating the process of democratic elections. Since Trump has become president, there have been open threats by Trump himself to use military force to remove the democratically elected President Maduro. Made that statement. Fact-check it. There have been increased sanctions by the U.S. against Venezuela in violation of international norms. Financial sanctions have been imposed against Venezuela. The attempt against all diplomatic norms by the Secretary General of the OAS, Luis Almagro, and other pro-U.S. states to use the OAS to create the conditions for a foreign military intervention in Venezuela. And in this regard, we supported the position of Prime Minister Dr. Keith Rowley when he condemned Luis Almagro, the Secretary General of the OAS, and said he should be removed because he quite clearly, this is Almagro, went way beyond the function of Secretary General by trying to manipulate the OAS and making open statements that had not been approved by the OAS, which is a body of 33 Latin American and Caribbean countries, when Almagro made statements condemning Venezuela and so on. And then we have had the most recent statement by former, well, when we wrote this, he was Secretary of State, but he was fired by tweet, Rex Tillerson, who was himself a former head honcho of the oil giant Exxon, that the solution to Venezuela might be a Chile-like coup d'etat, which was a reference to the coup d'etat by Pinochet, General Pinochet, in 1973, I think it was, 74, 73, against the democratically elected President Salvador Allende in Chile, which coup resulted in thousands of people being assassinated, tens of thousands being imprisoned without trial, thousands of people being tortured, many people were disappeared, never to be found again. Human rights were absolutely trampled upon. Trade unions were banned, protests were banned, freedom of speech was terminated, people were harassed, and so on. And this is what Rex Tillerson said should happen in Venezuela. We condemn that totally. And of course, the racist position of Donald Trump, let's never forget that, when he referred to countries such as ours, in the Caribbean, Haiti in particular, I think he mentioned El Salvador, and so on, as shithole countries. We must never forget the racist ideology of Donald Trump, which drives a lot of that. And we have subsequently now seen in the last few days, Rex Tillerson has been removed as Secretary of State and replaced by the head of the CIA, okay? And that suggests a further ramping up of the militarist position of the Trump administration. So we condemn these right-wing neo-fascist forces and the U.S. government for their plan to destroy the Bolivarian Republic. And we have confidence that notwithstanding the many difficulties that Venezuela is experiencing, many of which are the result of destabilization by these very elites, the majority of Venezuelans desire democracy and peace, and that they will vote for President Maduro and thus vote to preserve and deepen the legacy of President Chavez. We reiterate our support for the PSUV, the party of President Maduro and all progressive forces in Venezuela, and we stand with the democratically elected President Maduro and the democratically elected Constituent National Assembly, and we join with others in calling on CARICOM countries to do the right thing, to take a stand with respect to the internationally recognized principles of respect for sovereignty, respect for the self-determination, and non-interference in the affairs of other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Comrade David Abdullah, political leader of the MSJ. Earlier, I would have spoken about the Caracas Declaration, which declaration, may I remind you, have been endorsed, supported, and signed by Comrade Kafra Cambon and the Emancipation Support Committee, ourselves, Joint Trade Union Movement, as well as the Movement for Social Justice. So I would like to read into the public record that a very important Caracas Declaration, which came out of an international conference, Todos Somos Venezuela, held on the 5th to the 7th of March. The Caracas Declaration. We, men and women, citizens from different countries, social movements and organizations, political parties, women, youth, workers, creators and intellectuals, peasants and religious people, gathered in the city of Caracas on March 5th, 6th, and 7th, 2018, reaffirm our solidarity with and activist support to the Venezuelan people, to the Bolivarian Revolution, and to its people's government led by Comrade Nicolas Maduro Moros. We strongly reject the very serious escalation of aggressions against the democracy and sovereignty of Venezuela by the warmongering government of Donald Trump, the global corporate powers, and the military-industrial apparatus of the United States imperialism, which intend to overthrow the legitimate government of Venezuela, destroy the project of Bolivarian democracy, and seize the resources of the Venezuelan homeland. We denounce the fact that this operation against Venezuela is part of a global neo-colonialization strategy directed against Latin America and the Caribbean, which aims at imposing on our people a new era of vassalage and looting through the reinstating of the shameful Monroe Doctrine, a plan already under execution in several countries of the continent. We reject the threat made by Donald Trump to carry out an eventual military intervention in Venezuela. And we warn that such statements are not mere posturing. The military option against the Bolivarian Revolution is part of the U.S. geopolitical strategy and doctrine for the 21st century. The world must be aware of the fact that a military aggression against Venezuela might cause a crisis of historical dimensions and of uncountable and unpredictable human, economic, and ecological effects in the region. We warn the imperialist establishment and the lucky elites who follow their lead as follows. The peoples of Latin America, the Caribbean, and the world are never going to permit Venezuela to be stamped upon by the U.S. military boot. If, as a result of their insane obsession, the Washington Hawks dare to attack Simon Bolivar's homeland, it will be once more, as it was 200 years ago, the grave of an empire. We denounce the blatant pressure inflicted on governments of this region by the United States empire in order to involve them in political, diplomatic, and even military operations against the Bolivarian Republic of Venezuela. Such action is designed to destroy the regional integration and to implicitly abolish the principle established in the foundational charter of the Community of Latin America and Caribbean States, CELAC, that declares the region as a zone of peace. We reject the shameful and anti-historical behavior of those governments of the region that have knelt down in obedience to Washington's policies through the creation of illegal and spurious formations, such as the so-called Lima Group of States, the pitiful regional elites that lead the way in the looting of their people, undermine their nation's sovereignty in favor of transnational interests, increase the poverty and inequality levels of their countries, and violate human rights, lack any kind of moral and political authority to challenge Venezuelan democracy. We reject the unilateral and illegal sanctions that have been imposed against the Venezuelan people by the United States of America and the European Union, and which are designed to destroy Venezuela's economy and subdue its democratic will. Such blockades and sanctions are crimes against humanity committed by the international capitalist system and are seriously impacting on the Venezuelan people by sabotaging Venezuela's productive, financial, and commercial processes, and by preventing access to food, medicine, and staple goods. We reject the mean-spirited U.S. sabotage of the dialogue process held in the Dominican Republic between the Bolivarian government and several opposition forces, and reiterate that the only path to recovery of the political coexistence between Venezuelans is the path of full respect for the sovereignty of Venezuela, non-interference in its internal affairs, sincere dialogue, and electoral processes based on Venezuelan legislation. In this regard, we welcome the scheduling of presidential, state lawmakers, and councilmen elections for May 20th, 2018, which is the result of a political agreement with a sector of the Venezuelan opposition. The Venezuelan people will transparently and sovereignly decide the course of the Venezuelan homeland by these absolutely legitimate and constitutional elections. We alert the peoples of the world to the malicious intention of governments and international organizations that are directly involved in warfare against Venezuela to refuse to recognize the results of the elections scheduled to be held on May 20th, and to increase their attacks against what will undoubtedly be an authentic democratic expression of the Venezuelan people. We welcome and endorse the declaration of the Presidential Summit of the Bolivarian Alliance of the Peoples of Our America, ALBA, TCP, and categorically rejects the exclusion of Venezuela from the next Summit of the Americas slated to be held in Lima, Peru. Likewise, we support all the diplomatic and political actions undertaken by governments, countries, and peoples to defend the political plurality and diversity of our continent, and to safeguard the sovereignty and self-determination of our peoples. We recognize the heroic resistance of the Venezuelan people against the onslaught of the economic aggression, financial blockade, and all other forms of sabotage endured by Venezuela, and we support economic, financial, political, and diplomatic strategy implemented by the Bolivarian government and President Nicolas Maduro to overcome these problems and to build the humanist model of Bolivarian socialism. We commit ourselves to continue fighting for the truth, for peace, and for the sovereignty of Venezuela, constantly expanding the bonds of friendship, solidarity, and revolutionary commitment with the Venezuelan people. All the peoples of the world who fight for the just cause of humanity walk side by side with the Bolivarian Revolution, its leadership, and its people, and will always do so. We are convinced that Venezuela will manage to overcome the problems that it is facing by means of dialogue, respect for the Constitution, and the unwavering democratic will of its people. We are also convinced that the Bolivarian Revolution will continue to be a beacon of hope for the peoples of the world in the search for a worthy and just destiny for humanity. By commemorating the 5th anniversary of the transition of Commander Hugo Chavez, historical leader of the Venezuelan people, from the city of Caracas, we say to the world, Venezuela is not alone. I repeat, Venezuela is not alone. We all stand by it. We are all Venezuela. We shall prevail. Caracas, March 7th, 2018. And as I said, endorsed, supported, signed on by the Emancipation Support Committee, the Joint Trade Union Movement, as well as the movement for social justice, as well as other progressive forces in Trinidad and Tobago. So that, I will now open the floor for any questions. If there's anything else, either.
This question may seem to be from a capitalistic point of view, right? But the fact is that a lot of the nation states of the CARICOM, we are dependent upon the United States in terms of trade and security, this kind of thing, right? You recently with always interrogated, or didn't know what came out and say about the intelligence anyhow. The fact is, can we as a CARICOM nation really look to ignore our powerful neighbors to the north?
Okay. CARICOM countries have always had a recognition of the important principles of sovereignty of other countries. So in 1972, just 10 years after our independence, and a few years after the independence of Guyana and Barbados, 10 years after the independence of Jamaica, these four CARICOM countries, Trinidad and Tobago, Guyana, Jamaica, Barbados, established diplomatic relations with Cuba. At that time, the only other country in this hemisphere that had diplomatic relations with Cuba was Mexico. So here it was that in the face of the Cold War, in the face of the US blockade of Cuba, extremely hostile relations between the United States and Cuba, we recognized Cuba, established diplomatic relations with Cuba, and cultural exchanges took place, and economic exchanges took place, and so on. So the position of CARICOM has always been that we have the right, as any independent country or set of countries have the right, to engage in relations with all other countries. Yes? And so it's having a position at the OAS which says there must be no interference in the internal affairs of Venezuela by any foreign power, is consistent with the principles of the United Nations, consistent with the principles of the OAS itself, and consistent with all the norms of international relations. And that is what we are saying must continue. So we are not saying that the governments of CARICOM must break relations with the United States. We're not saying that at all. Neither economic, nor diplomatic, or cultural, or any other relations. But we are also saying that the United States must not violate international norms and principles and laws and so on by intervening in the internal affairs of Venezuela. You see, if we don't say that, then suppose a CARICOM country has a problem and some other large country, doesn't have to be the United States, it could be some other large country, decides to go in and invade that other country, as happened before in Grenada and so on, which is a whole different story. But then it puts us at risk. Suppose somebody doesn't like what Trinidad and Tobago does with natural gas, with negotiations with some companies that are British or Australian or American, and one of those countries decide they're going into Trinidad and Tobago. Then we would want other countries to say that those countries must not interfere in the internal affairs of Trinidad and Tobago. There must be no military intervention. There must be no promotion of a coup d'etat, and so on. They must not foment violence, but must respect the democratic processes and laws of Trinidad and Tobago. Would we want other people to say that about us? So therefore we must say that about Venezuela as well. It's a matter of principle. Yeah? Oh, just let me make one other point. Sorry, just one other point. It is interesting that Guyana is one of the countries in the Lima group. Now, the major oil company that has just found oil in Guyana is Exxon. Up to a few days ago, who was the Secretary of State of the United States? Rex Tillerson. What was he before he became Secretary of State? The CEO of Exxon. Yes? So there's no doubt. Yes, you just have to connect those dots. Yes?
I fully agree with what David just said. And I just want to add, because I don't think it's a question of ignoring our powerful neighbor to the north. but there are times when you really have to take a stand on principle, and David pointed out where it had been done in the past with Cuba in particular, and we survived it. The thing is that we really have to see ourselves as independent countries, and while you don't provoke the giants on your doorstep, at the same time, how far back do you go with compromise? Because all you are doing really is standing up for international principles, as David mentioned, standing up for the things that CARICOM believes in, and specifically in the case of Venezuela, standing up for a country that in recent times, from since Chavez time, has been extremely generous to the Caribbean and has floated economies that our neighbor to the north was not prepared to assist in the same way. And if we turn our backs on that, where do we expect to get that kind of cooperation at an international level in the future if people have that idea of CARICOM as so shifty that they can't even stand up? And what we are standing up for is elections. And if CARICOM says we are going to send observers for the whole process and all of that, then what can the objection of the United States be? Because we are not standing up for Maduro to do whatever he wants in Venezuela. We are standing up for the democratic process in Venezuela. And we have to look at the whole globe, and CARICOM has to have the courage to talk to countries outside of the United States orbit about what is taking place in Venezuela and giving support to the Venezuelan people and government that is trying to bring about democratic elections in Venezuela. And we have to be very clear in our own minds. One is self-interest is always a factor. And I could tell you it's better to stand up to the North now than have to face the consequences of Venezuela going back to those elites, which were burning people who look like me in Venezuela during the protests. And from what I understand, it is something like 29 people who were burnt to death as part of those protests. So we have to be very clear about what is at stake for us here in the Caribbean. And we are taking a stand consistent with international principles, and it's a very difficult stand for them to, for the United States to take any particular negative actions. I mean, they can, but it's the risk that we have to take in order to uphold our principles as a people in the Caribbean. I think we have to be guided by principle on a question as fundamental as this one is. So I'm in total agreement, and that's why we signed on to the Bolivarian Declaration.
Okay. All right. So if there are no more questions, I'd just like to close just by saying that in the end, it's about what kind of Americas do we want. When I say Americas, the region, Latin America, Caribbean. And we have the firm view that we want an Americas where peace, social justice, and freedom prevail. That is the Americas. So I'd like to thank you, members of the media, for coming and carrying this message. You will play a very important role in the struggle against imperialism. Thank you very much.